Hello, my name is Todd Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 22, this final episode of the Leaving Babylon series. And I want to thank you for joining me on this journey out of Babylon, and I hope that it's been a help to you and your friends and your loved ones. And just as every journey has an end, so too this journey has a final destination. And I hope that it's clear by now that the journey out of Babylon ends here in the covenant land. And of course, I suspect things will look a lot different when that time ultimately comes. But this is nothing new in the course of time and the progression of the covenant of restoration. The process of restoration often involves tearing down and destruction in order to make way for rebuilding and renewal. And how appropriate that I'm coming to you from the covenant land at a very special time, the appointed time known as the 8th day. Described in Leviticus 23:36, it says, "On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. It is an etzeret, and you shall do no customary work on it." We just finished the 7 days of Sukkot, which then leads into the 8th day, also known as Shemini Atzeret. It's a special day because it's the conclusion of the cycle of the annual appointed times, and it's specifically focused on 8, which is a number of the covenant of circumcision, and it refers to the renewal and new beginnings. Now, while Shemini Atzeret is associated with the number 8, it occurs on day 22 of month 7, and that has great prophetic significance. It's the final appointed time in the cycle that began in month 1. And now we see an end to that cycle in month 7. Notice that it's not the end of the year, which would typically be in month 12 or 13, but it is the end of the appointed times. And interestingly, it occurs at a time known as the end of the year. And we read about that in Exodus 34:22. It says, "And you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end." And the Feast of Ingathering refers to Sukkot. Now the word the year's end in Hebrew is Takufet HaShanah, and it literally means the turn of the year. So there's a turning or a shifting, a Takufa, that occurs around this time, and it's often referred to as the autumnal equinox. And just as the beginning of the cycle of the appointed times starts around the Takufa, referred to as the spring equinox, we see the cycle end around the Takufa, referred to as the autumnal equinox. Now these Takufas, or Tefukot, are discussed further in the time and calendar series. But for now, we're just focusing on the fact that this all culminates in month 7, rather than at the end of the calendar year, month 12 or 13. So even though it occurs on day 22 of month 7, it's called the 8th day. And 8 is the number of the covenant, and 8 is equivalent to the letter Chet in Hebrew. And the Chet in ancient Hebrew represents a fence or a wall. And just as the garden is known as Gan, and it means an enclosed place, that's why we saw a wall around the renewed Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. And I'm actually outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, and I can only enter in through one of the gates. And this is what we see through the Chet and the 8th day. It's a day of separation. It points to a covenant that is represented by a city, a garden that has 12 gates. And the fulfillment of this covenant that we're walking in is the New Jerusalem, which is the destination of our journey out of Babylon. Now, when we look at the Gematria of the number 8, we see many important connections. The first time that we read a word with the value of 8 is in Genesis 4:26. The word is Az, and it's Aleph, Zion, and Aleph is 1 and Zion is 7. So that word totals 8. And you know, we know that the Aleph actually looks like a bull. It means strength. And the Zion looks like a weapon, a sickle, a plow, or a pruning hook. And of course, these were interchangeable in ancient days because in times of peace, these instruments would be used for the harvest, and in times of war, they would be converted into swords and weapons. And we read about this conversion process in preparation for war in Joel 3:9 through 10. It says, "Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for war, wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near, let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong." And we also read about a conversion back after the time of war described in Joel, when Yeshua reigns from Zion. And it says, "Now it shall come to pass in the later days that the mountain of Yahweh's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the Elohim of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And that's Isaiah 2:2-4. So this first word equaling 8 carries quite a message. And the next time we see a word that equals 8 is come, enter, or pass. It's Bet Aleph Hey. And in Genesis 15:17, when it describes the covenant with Abram with 8 pieces. The next time that we see a word that equals 8 is love, Ahav, and it's Aleph Hey Bet. And we read that in Genesis 27:9, when Rebekah is instructing Jacob on how to get the firstborn blessing from his father. And of course, the father, Ha'ab, Hey Aleph Bet, also equals 8. So these are just a few examples how you can see 8 being so important in the covenant. And of course, it refers to a beginning or a new beginning, and ultimately, it's the day after the Sabbath, the renewal. So we can see how this will culminate at the end of the Sabbath reign, the millennial reign of Messiah. So it means new beginnings, and this is when the planet and the kingdom will be renewed. When the renewed Jerusalem descends from the new heavens upon the renewed earth, as we read about in Revelation 21. Beginning at 2, it says, "Then I, John, saw the set-apart city, the renewed Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from Elohim, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." Now, right now, the Messiah is preparing the renewed Jerusalem, and he will then return and prepare this planet for his bride to dwell with him. Of course, landing this 8th day appointed time on day 22 of month 7 is extremely significant. 7 is the number of creation and time, and we saw that time was divided into 7 from the first sentence of the Hebrew Scriptures, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And of course, from those 7 words, we saw the entire plan of Elohim laid out like a map of time. And the number 22 is also significant because it represents an end. Just as this 22nd episode is the conclusion of our journey, the Ta is the 22nd and final letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's the conclusion of the alphabet. And remember that the Aleph is the first, the Ta is the last. The Aleph is the beginning, the Ta is the end. And remember that the word that represents the Messiah is the Et, Aleph Ta. And Yeshua specifically identified himself with the Aleph Ta. And it's in a common English translation of Revelation 1:8, we read, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, says the Master, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty." Now, he wasn't speaking Greek, he was speaking Hebrew. And he actually said, "I am the Aleph and the Ta, the beginning and the end, says the Master, who is and who was and who is to come, El of hosts." That's what it would read properly. And Yeshua is not only stating that he is El of hosts, he's saying that he has been here since creation and he's coming back. He's also identifying himself as the Word, the Et, the Aleph Ta. And of course, Aleph equals strength, and Ta symbolizes an X, the cross, the covenant, the mark. The Aleph Taw is the strength of the covenant and contains and passes through all 22 Hebrew letters that lead to the covenant and that conclusion of the covenant. So as we reach this conclusion of the appointed times, we recognize that we're operating in cycles. We live in the present while we prepare for the future. And we've not reached a termination point as Westerners view the end. We're Hebrews, and we recognize that the end leads to a renewal, a new beginning. And because we live in cycles, we learn and draw closer to Him through these cycles, through these rehearsals of the appointed times. And here in Jerusalem, we've completed the 7 days of Sukkot, and so we no longer dwell in sukkahs. It's the 8th day, and it points to the fulfillment of the covenant journey. Now here's the renewal described in Revelation after the resurrection and judgment, when the covenant people no longer live in sukkahs. In Revelation 20, beginning at 11, we read, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before Elohim, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the set-apart city, the renewed Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from Elohim, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of Elohim is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. Elohim himself will be with them and be their Elohim, and Elohim will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Aleph and the Taw, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his Elohim, and he shall be my son. So we will become the sons of Elohim at that point, and that is the goal of this journey. This is all accomplished through Yeshua, the strength of the covenant, the Aleph Taw. And he will restore the tabernacle of David as prophesied in Amos 9:11. On that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old. Now interestingly, this is one of those examples, if we only read in the English, we're missing something very powerful, because it doesn't really say tabernacle in the Hebrew. It says the sukkah. And not only the sukkah, it says the et sukkah. So on that day I will raise up the et sukkah of David. So you've got the Aleph Taw, the Messiah, affixed to this sukkah that will be rebuilt, reestablished. So we see incredible messianic significance in that. And as David united the tribes and moved the tabernacle and the ark to Jerusalem, Amos refers to raising up this et sukkah, and the Aleph Taw, the Messiah, will build this sukkah. This is where the Messiah and his people will dwell until he finally brings down the renewed Jerusalem from the heavens, as we read in Revelation. That will be the culmination of the 8th day in a future Sukkot at the end of the Sabbath millennium. Now, as we discussed the significance of 8 with the letter Chet, we see that the New Jerusalem has great walls and gates, and it's laid out precisely like the camp of Yisrael in the wilderness. And we read about that in Revelation 12 through 13. It says, Also she had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and 12 angels at the gates, and the names written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. 3 gates on the east, 3 gates on the north, 3 gates on the south, and 3 gates on the west. So the renewed Jerusalem is for Yisrael. And Yisrael are those who are in covenant with Yahweh. And since the covenant was previously broken, the only way to get back into Yisrael is through the covenant renewed by the Messiah. So this city, it contains Yisrael, and you've got to be able to enter the city through one of those gates, which means you've got to be grafted in to Yisrael through Messiah. So we see that the 7th month is all about the Messiah and his fulfillment of the appointed times, which leads to a renewal of all creation through that renewed covenant. That covenant is a Hebrew covenant, best understood in the Hebrew language. And the words in the Hebrew language are important to guide us Hebrews on our journey. As we discussed, the ancient Hebrew language is closely connected with agricultural concepts and a nomadic lifestyle. And it's important that we view this journey as Hebrews, not Western Gentiles. We're nomads on this journey. We're living in temporary structures, sukkahs, as we're reminded every year, until we finally move back into the house. But only those who have the testimony of Yeshua and keep the commandments of Elohim will be in that house, and they are the ones who are in the renewed covenant, as we read about in Revelation 12:17 and 14:12. Now, we've talked about the importance of understanding the Hebrew language and thought throughout this entire series, and this becomes abundantly clear when we look at the Hebrew word for commandments, mitzvot. As with the word Torah, the English doesn't necessarily provide us with a full translation of the word mitzvot. When we think of commandments, we typically think of a list of do's and don'ts that have penalties associated with breaking them. According to Jeff Bennett, the word mitzvot Hebraically means the directions given to guide one on the journey. And of course, the first time we read the word mitzvot in the Hebrew text is in Genesis 26, when Yahweh told Isaac to dwell in the land promised to Abraham. And he confirmed the promises because Abraham obeyed. And we read about that in Genesis 26, beginning at 2. It says, "Then Yahweh appeared to him and said, 'Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my mitzvot, my statutes, and my Torah." So Abraham blazed the covenant path and succeeded because he believed the promises, and his belief was demonstrated by his actions. He moved his tent and followed the instructions. And the Torah is a roadmap, and the commandments are directions on this precarious journey out of Babylon, which ultimately leads to the promised land. That roadmap provides waypoints through the appointed times. And when man was in the garden, he partook of the fruits, and only after he was expelled from the garden was he required to toil in the dirt for his food. And the appointed times begin with the grain harvest, and they end with the fruits. And they point the way back to the garden. They actually provide that path back to the garden. So while our journey began in Babylon, we're merely on the same covenant path as our ancestors, trying to find our way back to the garden. It's in the garden where we find the fruit, and it's in the garden that we find true rest. And as I spent this past week in Jerusalem dwelling in a sukkah, it reminded me of the separation that still exists between Yahweh and his covenant assembly, Yisrael. As we left our sukkahs after 7 days and now rehearse the time of renewal on the 8th day, we long for the day when our journey ends, and we no longer have to rehearse Sukkot and dwell in sukkahs. And while we rejoice during this time, we realize that the true joy comes for those in the covenant when the rehearsals are over and the journey ends. And it will actually just be a beginning, a new beginning. So it's been my pleasure helping to guide you out of Babylon. This is an ancient journey that's been blazed by many before us and continues until the fulfillment of this final 8th day. Our journey out of Babylon will not be complete until we finally return to the garden, and the way back was provided through the covenant renewed by the Messiah. He showed us how to walk that path, and he sent his Spirit to guide us and strengthen us. He also instructed and warned in Matthew 7:13 through 14, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." So I encourage you to stay on the path and don't veer off to the right or to the left. And that was the goal of this series. And I hope that you found it to be helpful so that you don't veer to the right or to the left. If you need more information, I'd encourage you to check out the 12-part Walk in the Light series, as well as our other books and articles and with teachings and resources on the website. You may even consider joining us on one of our trips to the Promised Land for one of the appointed times. There really is nothing like actually coming to the land and literally walking out the covenant journey for yourself. So we look forward to hearing from you and continuing this journey together as we are all leaving Babylon. Until we meet again, my name is Todd Bennett. Shalom.